Hello, Mr. General Shannon. Welcome to our program. We are going to talk about Canadian culture and politics and relationship between Turkey and Canada. Shall we start?
Let's start.
How much Canadian culture and cuisine famous in the world? What do you think about it?
I would say Canadian culture tends to be famous mostly in the United States because we have a lot of artists who develop their skills in Canada and then they eventually end up in the United States because it's a bigger market and there's more money to be made. And so whether it's singers like Justin Bieber or Alanis Morissette or Avril Lavigne or there are a number of performers who make it big in the United States, and in many cases people don't know they're Canadian. They assume that they're American, for example. So we usually end up exporting our culture by way of the United States. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do in my role is to better acquaint the Turkish public with Canadian culture, because I don't think people really know much about Canadian culture. And so some of that is, for example, bringing Canadian cinema to Turkey. So I'm hoping to organize a Canadian film festival in Istanbul later this year.
How exciting!
Yeah, as well as also showing some of the Turkish Canadians, so Turks who moved to Canada and became culturally very active, people like Merjan Dede, for example. These are cultural bridges that we have between our two countries. So I'm hoping to help Turkish public become more familiar with these.
When you come to Turkey, which things surprised the most?
Well, I actually knew Turkey reasonably well before I became Consul General, because I've been living in Istanbul for 3 years now. And I had visited before for work and as a tourist. So I knew Turkey reasonably well. I knew Istanbul quite well before I started my job. I think what surprised me was the extent to which it really is, as people say, it's a bicontinental city, Istanbul. It's half in Europe, half in Asia, and it really is true.
What Turkish and Canadian governments should do to have better interaction and relation between each other?
Yeah, well, it's something we have good relations now, and work together with Turkey in a number of areas. For example, we're in NATO together. We do joint exercises together in the Black Sea. We're both doing our part to fight Daesh in Syria and Iraq. So there's a lot that's going on that's creating a very positive relationship. There are a lot of Turkish students who would like to study in Canada, and we're keen to actually recruit more and more Turkish students because we have a growing market of international students in Canada, and Turkey is actually a very small percentage of that.
But Turkish students successful there?
Yes, very much so. In fact, there are a few success stories that I can point to, including the president of Waterloo University, for example, is a Turkish Canadian. So it's somebody who went to Turkey many years ago as a student. He was very successful. He stayed. He became a professor, and now he's the dean of a university. So we have about 60,000 Turkish Canadians in Canada, and many of them came for the first time in order to seek educational opportunities, and they became successful professionals. So yeah, we do find that there's a lot of successful Turks who have very good experiences in Canada. Many, of course, come back to Turkey, and so we're seeing a lot of influential people who have degrees from Canadian universities. So one of the things that we're hoping to do as well is build a network of Canadian university alumni in Turkey, because again, there's many of them and people don't know, this person went to Canadian University and did very well for themselves here in Turkey.
Do you think that there is enough research about Canada in Turkey, or is there enough research in Canada about Turkey?
Interesting. Well, certainly in Turkey, I find there's not a lot of research about Canada. Again, I find most members of the public in Turkey don't have a very clear idea of what Canada is. They tend to think of our natural resources. They think it's a cold place, a big place. These days, what they know is Prime Minister Trudeau. Everybody knows Prime Minister Trudeau. A lot of people follow he's very famous. People follow him on social media. So I find that the level of familiarity is increasing, but there's still not a lot of knowledge about Canada beyond the major cities. For example, people know Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver. They don't know the rest of the country. So again, what I'm trying to do in my job is to increase the level of knowledge. So I've been spending a lot of time at many universities, including Bahçeşehir here, and a few others, lecturing a little bit on our foreign policy, our culture, because for the first time I sense that people are actually interested in these issues.
But I want to ask a different thing.
Sure.
Is there any problem with racism in Canada?
Well, I mean, and every country is, no country is perfect, and Canada is no exception. Certainly, we have a history with our native peoples, which has been a very difficult history, and I think they would certainly not say that there is no racism in Canada. Certainly, there is. But I think what people find, particularly from the Muslim world, is that it's an incredibly tolerant society. I think we showed that with our welcome of about 40,000 Syrian refugees in the last year. Canada was really unique among countries. Many countries in Europe and elsewhere in the Americas were closing their borders and saying, we don't want this problem. We actually invited, 40,000 Syrian refugees, including about 10,000 from Turkey. So it's something we have in common with Turkey. We've actually opened our doors to people.
That's very good.
Mm.
I think that is there enough relation between Canada and Europe, especially European Union?
Well, I mean, we have very long-standing relationships with Europe, and in the last few months, we've signed a free trade agreement between Canada and the European Union for the first time. So I think our level of interaction and commerce is increasing. What worries us a little bit, of course, is the fact that the European Union itself looks a bit fragile at the moment, obviously with the UK pulling out in the wake of a Brexit referendum. So we've been watching developments in Europe through the recent elections in France, for example, to reassure ourselves that the union remains strong. And I think our Prime Minister and Chancellor Merkel have spoken many times to try to reinforce our alliances, whether it's with the EU, whether it's with NATO, because we really believe in the importance of a strong, united Europe. So again, I think our commercial links are on the increase, and historically we have a very strong relationship with Europe.
But what do you think about the former election in the United States and France?
Well, obviously the U.S. election was very significant for us for many reasons, but most importantly, you may know, 70% of our exports go to the United States, and that is by virtue of the North American Free Trade Agreement. That is the most important commercial agreement that Canada has, and obviously President Trump was elected on a promise that he would renegotiate NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. So that has become our most important foreign policy priority, is protecting that agreement. You can't overemphasize the importance of that relationship. What we've seen in Europe, though, is several elections in which the nationalist parties have not done as well as many were predicting. So again, to us, that's reassuring because we believe in a strong, united Europe. And as our Prime Minister has said, we believe in a world that is open to trade, open to the movement of people and ideas.
If a person visits Canada or wants to immigrate to Canada, what would surprise him or her the most?
That's a difficult question to answer because every person's experience is different. Obviously, I've spoken to many people who've had the experience of visiting Canada or immigrating to Canada. I think what they might find is, unlike certain countries in Europe and unlike the United States to a certain extent, in our cities, we don't tend to segregate. So we don't tend to have areas that are immigrant areas or immigrant neighborhoods. People tend to be fairly mixed, and neighborhoods tend to be fairly mixed. So I would say you'd be surprised at who your neighbors are, for example. You might find that they're from other countries, you might find that they're from Africa, or you might find that they're Canadians, from 5 or 6 generations. So I think that's something that people tend to find a bit surprising. And again, I think most visitors and most immigrants find people generally very welcoming. I think if you look at the opinion polls in Canada, we tend to view immigration by and large as a very positive thing. And touch wood, that hasn't changed. So I think people find Canadians welcoming to people from all over the world.
What do you think about the Syrian war?
The Syrian war?
Yeah.
Well, obviously it's the most serious humanitarian crisis in the world right now. our government's position has been that a negotiated solution is the only outcome. You cannot have a military outcome. One side will not prevail over the other. So a resolution by force is not an option. For that reason, for years we've been participating in supporting the peace negotiations that have been ongoing in Geneva and elsewhere. We've been working with the peaceful, moderate Syrian opposition to try to, bolster their position and encouraging them to come to the table with pragmatic solutions. And we've said, Bashar al-Assad is not part of the solution either. And again, most of our focus has been on the diplomatic support for the peace process and humanitarian support. So we've made, quite significant contributions to meeting the basic needs of war-affected people, as well as opening our doors to, again, upwards of 50,000 Syrian refugees.
Just in terms you are so sensitive about women's rights,
Yes.
LGBT rights,
That's right.
and Syrian refugees.
Mm-hmm.
Does it create an awareness in Canadian society?
Does it create an awareness in Canadian society? I think that awareness is already there. I think Canadians generally are very aware of these issues and care a lot about them. I think what's changed is he's made it a priority in our foreign policy, and I think Canadians generally expect our values to be reflected in our foreign policy and how we deal with other countries. So we've been quite vocal about again our support for things like LGBT rights, without necessarily hammering those countries that don't necessarily agree with us. So our view is to promote these values that we think are important, but doing so respectfully without generating a negative reaction or a backlash from other countries that are not as progressive. I think it's a combination of the things that he said and the things that he's done. So appointing a cabinet that is 50% women was very important to him. And I think it's connected with a lot of people in the world who say, it's time for Western country to have a feminist foreign policy, which is how he's described it. So I think these are things that people really respond to. It's a sense that he doesn't just talk progressively. He also takes actions that are very progressive, and I think it's built a lot of credibility for Canada in the world.
Just until someone hang around and running and go jog without any guardians. What do you think about it?
No, I think he's got bodyguards. They're probably very fit though, and so they run with him, and they don't let him out of their sight. No, I think he's very responsible about his role.
Justin Trudeau's athletic body and even backside are so famous. What do you think about it?
I don't have a reaction to that except to say that he takes very good care of himself. And it's funny, we met him in the month of June last year. He met all of Canada's ambassadors who were going out on posting. He spoke with us for a good hour and a half. And one of the things that I remember is him talking about the importance of making time in your day for exercise and for sleeping well. And we were all laughing, but actually it is rather important, and he's a good demonstration of that. He's the Prime Minister. He may well be one of the busiest people in government in Canada, and yet he said he makes time for these things, because if he's not healthy and in good physical form, he's not mentally sharp and isn't able to perform to a high level. So we've actually put a lot of emphasis in our system, the diplomatic service, on wellness and physical and mental fitness this year. So, thank you for this opportunity. I enjoy speaking about Canada, and I enjoy meeting students and young people here in Turkey. Again, I've had a great welcome at Bahçeşehir University and in other universities that are really interested in what Canada represents these days. So it's always a great opportunity for me to meet young people and to answer their questions.